Now I would like to go over more evidence of buildings melting. Sorry about that. I used the wrong one. I used a little thinner. So you can see how it became smooth and began to melt here. And just some more pictures. As you can see, the melting here, it's become smooth from the melting here. And from above, you can see what looks like melted ice cream. But it's all the result of a major grid failure, meltdown, melting all the buildings on the grid and everything around it like ice cream. Again, this is actual building. The red brick lines have been just smeared and other parts cooked. It's melted like ice cream here. Notice how it melted away and swollen up. You can see the brick lines here, the top of the tower dome there. Here, you have brick lines. It was super hot, melting. You can see the crust on the outside. It actually even preserved the carbon dense orange red brick color of the brick. It almost looks like lava still. It's incredible that it almost looks like liquid lava still. The melted building. Here's the brick lines here. Almost looking pretty gritty right there. Grid, I mean, melted like ice cream, domes, arches, windows, everywhere. Completely melted. Grid meltdown. As you can see, it's like melted ice cream. The entire grid melted down. Everywhere you see above the flooded waters is nothing but melted buildings. The only reason all continents are melted buildings. Yes, that's right. No such thing as continents or mountains. And again, what you can see here, just absolute building structure completely melted. Towers, domes, everything just melted like ice cream. Here you can see the brick lines. And again, everywhere you look, you're looking at melted buildings or the tops of melted buildings sticking up out of what was hot liquid melted building flood. Again, you can see the structure here before it was melted. The brick lines melted like ice cream. On the left, it was separating, forming holes when it became melted and viscous. As you can see here, the red brick concrete was melting. It was really hot. It was melting down, and then all of a sudden it froze it and hardened it in time. Hard as a rock because it is concrete and red brick. And what you'll notice here is we'll get to this later. I'm not going to go into that right now. You still see the irrigation system still intact, water flowing out of all these melted buildings still. Again, look at all the melting here. And on the right, the building on the right was completely obliterated and melted. That's a building. And then this building here melting over and then frozen in time. And the irrigation system's still intact. Here you can see the building, how it melted out towards the water here. Again, all this is flooded. Here you can see the A-frames from the melting. It melted out this way. got flooded. The actual ground level in buildings are flooded. The actual ground level's down there. Every continent, everything is melted buildings. Here you can see melted buildings. And then the liquid buildings flooded all around the grid. It was hot, melted these buildings like ice cream. And then they hardened real fast as well. As you can see here, it was melting, forming these rock curtains, just melting this concrete red brick, just forming these rock curtains, and then it froze them in time, in midair. And of course, the irrigation system's still intact. The water is still flowing out of all these buildings. I'll get to a video on that showing the countless evidence of this. More melted buildings. You can see the melting. Here you can see the melting. The concrete molds just completely obliterated and melted like butter. More melting. Concrete molds melted. Here's more building grid on the ground, melted building. Here's more melted buildings, just completely. Once it becomes so hot, once it becomes so hot and viscous, it begins to flow, in this wave after wave, because it's becoming from a solid into a liquid. It's melting the brick lines like ice cream. The X Factor event melted these buildings. And look at the steps, how they've been completely melted. Here you can notice the smooth texture here from being melted. Here you can see it, the waves of it being melted. Here you can see the concrete molds of this statue's head has been melted, and it's dripping down smooth this way. Smooth. Took his head. Again, underneath all the concrete molds, what do you see? Red brick, of course. Red brick. Again, this is fantastic. Go get you some butter or ice cream and just throw it in the microwave now. And this is what you get. It starts to melt. It starts to flow down. It's become viscous, hot. Here it's flowing down from the top. It's hot. Here we have what was probably some type of statue or monument, concrete molds of a building here that have been how do you call it? Scorched, melted through the waves. And again, when the heat expands, notice how it is expanding in all directions perfectly in an even circle. It spreads out this concrete. See how it spreads out the concrete to the point that some of these rocks become so buoyant they float. It spreads out the concrete so much as it expands out the heat in all directions. Not these specifically, but there are rocks that float because it's just this red brick concrete that has spread the concrete so thin that instead of it's dense, it becomes buoyant over the water and it floats. More rock curtains dripping down, melted buildings, pancaked brick lines. Here you can see how the building melted down this way. They put a lot of golf courses on melted buildings. Again, you can see the structure here. This was all hot like liquid, melted building like lava. And this is the top of what didn't get flooded. That's why it looks awkward and buried and flooded, because it is. The rest of this has been damaged, as you can see. There's a remnant right there, pocket of survival, pocket of survival. I think this is the Ritz-Carlton Hotel or something. Again, more melted, more holes, more separation. Here is really crazy and unique because you have rope, wooden barrels rope, And then you have liquid concrete that was hot. You still can see the actual color of the lava. It actually froze in time for us to see the color of the lava as the heat expanded and broke open this crust of concrete before it was hardened, and before the X Factor event hardened, all this concrete was flowing over wood, rope, getting saturated to an extent over this barrel. You can see where it opened up here. This was hot like liquid lava. See the color? It's still there as well. And the concrete has come all up on and into this. And these are all hard as a rock like concrete because it was all melted liquid building. It's flowed on top of it and densified it all and hardened it like concrete. But you can see here where it got hot and ripped open the thin layer, and it's still the same color as hot lava. Again, there it is. Excuse me. Still the same color of hot lava, red brick, carbon-14, color cooked out here. It's busted open, the thin layer. When it was hot, you can see how how this is dripping. See how it's coming over? Rock curtaining, dripping, and covering everything, and hardening it up like hard as a rock and liquid building concrete, because that's what it was. You can explain everything when you have the truth. It's all concrete. Look, it's just concrete. It's all melted concrete. You can still see the color of the brick here and the lava. All melted concrete. See, the wood has been turned into concrete because it saturated it with the liquid building when it had melted. And then it hardened up again, and because that's what it is, it's concrete. It's saturated in the wood and it formed concrete. It's not a fossil. It's actual liquid melted building getting saturated with other objects and then hardening. It's as simple as that. Just like this, you can see where the building has become hot and melted and then began to flow and flood itself. And I love this here. I love how you can absolutely see how this got hot and began to flow in this direction, covering up the grass. And then it stopped and hardened it like a rock, and look, that's all hard as a rock again, but it was flowing. You can see the direction of it flowing like hot lava. Imagine that being hot like lava and flowing in that direction. It's just hot liquid building from the grid meltdown, from the X Factor event, and which was probably a grid meltdown. And you can see how it was flowing this way. It's probably a grid meltdown, which could be effective. The dual sun arcing against the dome and the grid. Here you can still see. Here you have the towers, the brick lines, the melted towers, buildings. Melted buildings flowing, getting melted like ice cream. Showed this earlier. Here's a close-up of the Ritz. Here on the left you see the columns, the towers. But it's pretty much very melted building. Here you can see it was flowing, viscous, wavy after wave. Here you can see the concrete flowing that way. Pocket of survival, that this whole thing has been melted and flowing this way. When it becomes viscous, it begins to flow out and form new land. Tower, brick lines, towers, arches, windows, all melted buildings. Again, you can see the direction of the flow when it begins to melt out and away from itself. You see the melting. See how that melted out this way, cooked out the color. That was really hot there, cooked out that red color carbon. Here you can see the flow. Whoops. My mouse is tripping. Here you can see the hot melted buildings was flowing this way. Here's a person down here, two of them. Just enormous, huge buildings being destroyed and melted. Here they are being melted outward. Here's all the different melting away like butter and ice cream. Melting, connecting, melting. Getting flooded. Brick lines, arches, windows. Hot scorch marks, dripping. It's quite an X-Factor event here. Here you can see that this has basically been melted like a pile of ice cream here. Wave after wave, viscous. People here. Again, all these buildings, everything you're walking on is melted buildings. Here you can almost see how it was flowing and viscous before it hardened back up. This building has been completely melted. Here you can see how it's melted down and away, and you can still see the brick lines. Here you can see the melting tops of these buildings sticking up out of the flooding melted building. Here you can see what's left of tops of buildings. Looks like it got hit by a pretty hot, fast wind. Here, it's fantastic evidence of the building is just melting and dripping downwards, forming rock curtains, literally. And then it hardened back up in thin air, in midair. And again, the irrigation system is still intact and flowing out of these buildings. I'm going to show an entire, shortly, show many of these waterfalls, which are really just irrigation systems still intact, still flowing out of these buildings. And again, the rock curtains, melted buildings, and then frozen in midair, hardened. And again, this statue, concrete mold is melting. Excuse me, and then it's hardened back up in midair. Again, this building is melting outward, forming new land. As you can see, it's melting outwards, flowing outward, melting what's left of buildings. Here, this is all melted like ice cream, just like melted butter. Here, more rock curtains melting down. Irrigation system still intact. Again, more literally like curtains of rock. Just like literal curtains of rock here, frozen in time, hardened and stopped in midair. It's hot, it's melting, it's falling, and then no. Freezes it, hardens it in midair. Tons of this evidence all over the world of buildings melting and then frozen in midair, densified in midair, frozen in time for us to see these rock curtains forming from melted buildings. Incredible evidence of red brick, literally, and concrete melted together. Again, you can see how it was melted out this way, and then this melted. And this, you get the brick lines of the building, and then it just melts outward, forming new land. Whoops. Again, remnants, pocket of survival, hardly. You can still see that this is a building, and then it's just completely melted like butter. Just look at how it's melted everywhere, dripping wet. Some drip with the black scorch marks from the heat. Here it's melted hot. Again, very melted. Again, more evidence that the buildings became hot and viscous. Anybody could have came along and did this when the buildings were hot before they died. If they died. Again, this is more evidence of how this became very hot to the point it was viscous and malleable and impressionable by a being a hand here, pressed against this here and here. And then it hardened back up again, hard as a rock, because that's what it is. Here you see the little holes pulling apart from being viscous when it was hot. Again, this became hot and viscous and melted. Look at this, it melted. It literally melted the tower here. Here, it melted the concrete molds. Here it turned the bottom of the red brick building into rock. Here it was melting and flowing down into the street on the left here. It has literally flowed down into the street here. More melted building, and here's a little tiny pocket of survival of what it looked like before the rest of it was melted. The top here, a little pocket of survival, but this was columns and concrete over red brick. Here, mangled, destroyed. You can see the melting layer after layer, layer after layer, as it melted its way down. It solidified, densified, layer after layer, wave after wave of melting down on itself, and then it hardened in layers after layer of the melting, and it hardened back again. There's an A-frame there. I showed this one, but these are brick lines completely melted. Tops of buildings. Here, more brick lines. Tops of buildings up here. No such thing as mountains, canyons, valleys, gulches. It's all just buildings in between buildings. As you can see, the buildings melted from the bottom as well, from the grid. Here, the upside down ice cream cone roofs have been melted down to hardly anything left of the buildings. There's hardly anything of the roof. The upside down, tower to the dome style roof. There's some brick lines here. Here you can really see the melting and the flow, how it's just flowing down and melting, forming rock curtains, concrete, because that's what it is. You see the A-frames from the heat melting down over the arches and columns of the concrete all over itself, so you can't tell that it was a building. So the layman can't tell that this was a building, but to those who do the research, the Eagle Eye crew, they get the eyes to see, and they can clearly see the melting and the dripping, and that all mountains were really just melted buildings. And it's hot, viscous holes, and it becomes malleable, conforming to some type of grid or heat field. See these grid lines. Another phenomenon we identified from my research. Again, what you see here is buildings melting away from the center of itself, flowing outward like ice cream. Everywhere you look, melted buildings like ice cream. There's a person here. It literally kind of looks like melted ice cream everywhere, like sherbet. Here, the inside of what it looks like in the inside of these buildings when they melt. There's no such thing as caves or underground bases. It's all just inherited, confiscated, melted buildings. Again, a lot of these buildings get completely filled in, but sometimes they don't. But it's melting, it's hot, and it's hardened again in midair. Remember how I showed the rock curtains, how they hardened in midair again? That's what happened here as well. It was all dripping, wet, hot, and then it hardened and caught it in midair so we could see it, if you will. Again, just look at the concrete molds here that survived in here, but it's all melted buildings. You can see more melting here, more melting, viscous, separating, pulling apart, creating these holes, and then harden again. Here it was melting and then hardened again. Again, here is what they call lava from a volcano, but it's really just some of these buildings still hot from the X Factor event. And this is what happens when it gets hot. This nature of heat is when the solids get really hot, they become viscous and flow. And when they cool off from the cooler temperature blowing on it up here, it hardens again. Hard as a rock. You see the cooler areas here where it hardened very fast again. And then where it's hot and it's flowing, it becomes viscous again. This is the nature of heat. And you'll see this in all of the melted buildings from the grid meltdown. This is a close-up of brick melting, red brick melting. And here's red brick and concrete over the brick melting, kind of melting together, if you will. Here, the inside of buildings dripping and then solidified and hardened again. Here, the ground was so hot and viscous and melting that the entire building sank into the ground. Here, the building sank into the ground and pancaked the brick lines, and it became, you can see where it was hot and flowing, and then hardened real fast again. Incredible melting here of the interior of these buildings. Here's the exterior rock curtain here, melting this building. Here, ceiling from the old world, infrastructure melted black from the X Factor event. Here, the ceiling mortar is melting. More melted buildings. See the waves after wave of melting here when it became hot and viscous. Whoops. And then you see the arches from the buildings, the domes. Here it's just completely melted. Here it's melting down and then hardened real fast again. Heat from the bottom, from the grid, melting this building. Wavy melting brick lines pancaked. Brick lines melted, sinking into the ground. Structure from the old world melted. The red brick down at the bottom here, this whole thing was brick, red brick, but as you can see, it has balloon rocked out and expanded outward. But it was all originally red brick. But it expanded outward when it became viscous and balloon rocked outward and formed these rocks from the X Factor event. Again, more structures from the old world melted. Hot brick-lined buildings just melted like ice cream. Tops of buildings everywhere we look, sticking out of the flooded ground. Melted, flowing, hot buildings. Flowing outward and away from themselves. And then the interior. Please excuse my cough, I'm sorry about that. And then look at the interior melting here. Dripping, frozen in time. Tops of buildings melted, sticking out of the ground. Here, separating viscous hot, coming apart, melting like ice cream, flooding away from, look at that, melting, flooding away from the building here. The interiors of these buildings completely melted, except for some open areas here that we call caves. Just incredible evidence of melting from the X Factor event. Here you can still see some color from the brick, the red carbon-14. Heat expanding outward in circles here. Heat expanding outward in circles here. Melting over. Tops of buildings sticking out of the ground. Melted buildings, rock curtains concealing the building behind it. Pockets of survival. Here you have the building just completely melting in this area here. And here pretty good too. Brick lines, melted red brick. Here we can see more evidence of wave after wave, frozen in time, melted, pancaked brick lines, becoming viscous, flowing, hot. Everywhere you see, it begins to flow, and then it was hardened and frozen in time for us to see this waviness here. Here the floor, ground became so hot and viscous from the grid meltdown that you can see how it began to sink down. Notice these are parallel lines, and this is sinking down. Notice that this is sticking up as well, popping up from the sinking down here. This is popping up. See, the entire floor here became hot and viscous and then hardened right back up again. This is hard as a rock now. Again, when it hardened and cooled off from the X Factor event, cooled off, the grid meltdown cooled off, and boom, it's hard as a rock. Frozen in time for us to see that it was hot, dripping wet. Dripping, melting, like it would, like dripping wet. Here are the blocks that got cooked into block here. Huge blocks just cooked together from this X Factor event. Here you can see the wavy flow outward here. This way, the color is scorched black, and there's still a lot of red color here. It was viscous here. See the waviness. Again, the nature of our reality is when things become very, very hot, the solid begins to flow and become viscous, and it becomes liquid, and it begins to flow. Where it's cooled off the most, it hardens and solidifies and densifies the most. And where it's the hottest, it flows and becomes viscous the most. So where it's the hottest, it's the most liquid. Where it's the coldest, it's the most solid. This is the nature of heat. And this is the nature of melted buildings from the X Factor event. You can see how it flowed away from the building here. You can see how it flowed down and around. What's the building here? Here it's flowing this way. Here you can see the melted building flowing out in the way this way. Here you can still see the brick lines and the top of the building. Brick lines, brick lines, brick lines, top of the building, top of the building. More buildings in the background, melted, flowing outward down that way. Brick lines, brick lines. And again, it's survived in the building. There's a road coming here, and they're going inside the hollow building out the other side. To this day, it's pocket of survival, and they can drive through the building here. Nobody carved this out. It just happened to work out, and they discovered that, hey, we can drive through here still. Or actually, we can drive through here. They built a road, obviously. This is on top of a building here. Here at the bottom of the building got hot from the grid meltdown. X-Factor event. Starts coming up the wall of the building, expanding out, and destroying the buildings from the heat. Here, the building literally sinks downward into the ground, and the liquid building flow begins to flow over. There's a liquid building flow, it's actually flowing over, forming rock curtains, flowing over the building here from the melting, the other building here, and then this is sinking down in the ground. This should be level, not this way. The pancake brick lines have expanded out into block here. It's a melted building from the X-Factor event, sink down into the ground. Here, more buildings, just brick lines just melted like ice cream. Here, buildings, tops of buildings, what's left of them, A-framing from the heat, melting. It's all turned to dust. This was hot and flowing like a liquid lava with melted building at one point during the X-Factor event. More buildings melted and flowing. The brick lines literally just becoming viscous, solid into a liquid here. Tops of melted buildings everywhere we look. Scorched black marks as well. Upside down ice cream cone. Tops of buildings melted down. Inside of the buildings melted, hardened. More melted buildings. See how it melted out this way? It melted out this way, and it melted away from itself that way. And then got flooded here. Melted out this way. Again, the entire bottom of the building was flooded with hot liquid. Melted building like lava, and it literally scorched the bottom of the building here. Here, more melted building. And then they come in and use them and so forth. Here, more buildings completely melted. On the right here, the black, scorching, dripping, melted building. Here, the inside of melted buildings is what you would call a cave, but it's just melted buildings. You can see the wave after wave of the melting here. It's all the inside of melted buildings here. And again, the steps here literally have melted into each other here. Just like these steps have melted from the X-Factor event. And then some more steps melted. More melted buildings, tops of melted buildings. Incredible flooded, melted, damaged building here. It must have been beautiful in its day. Here we have melted steps. Here, this building just, I don't even know what to call it. It just melted into this, whatever you want to call this. Here, you'll see the floor is just completely hot and begins to melt down into itself. Again, I show many times how the ground begins to become so hot from the grid meltdown that it just sinks down into itself. Here, these buildings have just been melted like butter, ice cream. The ceiling here completely melted, and here it's dripping. Again, this entire building has been turned into crystal. See the arch here? Brick lines. Or whatever rock you want to call it. It kind of looks like a crystal, but yeah, it's a building. Here, the heat has come up from the bottom. It managed to work its way all the way up to these arches of the building here and the top here. It's even started to mangle that. But this was all a building. It was all straight down like this. And it just starts to melt. Well, I mean, it was probably over here, obviously. It was down here. Sorry about that. And this is a pocket of survival. It just survived, and it didn't quite melt it like it did the bottom. More melting. Again, you can see how this melted down over itself and down. This is melted down this way and then hardened again. It formed a rock curtain here and concealed the building behind itself. Here the brick building just began to melt down into the ground. These are the top of building here and brick lines here. Balloon rocks there. Dripping, melting, and then hardened in time for us to see. Here, it's still looking kind of red brick, red lava looking. Melted the top, the buildings. These are tops of buildings here. The very tops. They're flooded. Again, the building here just completely dripping. I think I showed one, but this is a better close-up. Here, the buildings have just melted like ice cream. Same here, tops of buildings. Again, the bottom of the building has melted outward, away from itself here. Even the interior here is melted. Here, the building is just melted. More melted buildings everywhere you look. All mountains are melted buildings. No such thing as mountains. Again, the heat's coming up from the ground here, from the grid. Expanding, swelling out, marshmallowing out, balloon rocking outward. Pulling apart, separating. Melted here from the bottom. Just completely obliterated. Hot, melted, dripping, scorched. Look at the dripping here. I mean, just that almost looks like hot yellow liquid lava still. It used to be red brick with the concrete mold over it, but it's completely dripping wet. Not wet, but dripping like it was wet. Here, the red brick coming out in wave, layer after layer, melting and then hardening. Layer after layer flowing and then hardening back up again. Oops. Just completely melted. There's hardly anything to... You really can't even tell this was a building, but this is a building that's been turned from a solid into a liquid, into mush like mud. Again, this is incredible evidence of, you can see the red brick, and then you can see the brick lines and the red brick, and then you can see the upgraded concrete molds over the brick. And then it's just melted into the brick together here. It's just coming off the brick here. But this building is just completely... I mean, that even looks like crystallized here in some areas of the brick here, I have to say. Here it's just melting. Here's some columns that survived somehow. Here it's just melted away from itself like ice cream. Hardened back up again. It still looks like a hot lava. It even has the red-orange brick color. Here are the columns. have melted. The floors are heat damaged, scorched. Here this building has completely sank down into itself with some pockets of survival down here. Wreck lines, tops of buildings up here. Tops of buildings sticking out of the ground. Here the building's just melted like ice cream. Everywhere you look, melted like ice cream. Like a grid meltdown. The grid had a meltdown. Like ice cream. There's brick lines, upside down ice cream cones, roofs, brick lines. Melted like ice cream. You can see the direction it melts. Melted. Melted here. The brick lines are going this way and that way, and the arches are melted. Brick lines melting every which direction down into itself. Here this just melted the interior. Here the outside is forming a rock curtain and melting this way over this poor thing. It's getting hit. This all is getting rock curtain covered up by itself. Melted like ice cream. Frozen in midair, the melting here. Frozen in midair. Melted buildings. Again, the building just is getting mangled from the bottom here and actually from the top. It's just melted the top downward here. And then it's coming up from the bottom here as well. This building is just absolutely getting destroyed and melted. It's incredible. And then flooded to hide the evidence. Here the building is just melted outward like a circle. Melted like ice cream. Again, you can see how it's melted outward. You can see, you can literally draw the A-frames here. Just literally A-frame after A-frame. A-frame, A-frame. A-frames. These buildings just got melted. Again, you can see it flowing around the rock and then it hardened again. This was all liquid like lava flowing like a river around this rock here. And then it hardened. And then here you can clearly see how it melted out and away from itself. And here too. And here. Look at the top here, how it kind of got blackened when it melted. That's wild. It's just more melted building. The whole side of this building has actually swollen out like a balloon. This building here just completely blackened and scorched and melted. Another angle of this I showed earlier of this coming up, melting all the way up to the top almost. Here at the bottom, it's just completely swollen and damaged the building from the hot X-Factor event and become flooded in itself. There you have brick lines melted like ice cream. Here you can see how the main part of the building here, here's the top of the building here, and then the bottom of the building, you can see how it's melted outward and downward. And away from itself here. You can see how it made new land here when it melted. Over here, here. Forming new land when it hardened back up again. Here, more melted building. You can see how it melted down this way. You can see how this melted. can see how this kind of melted this way. So all buildings melted. All islands and continents are tops of melted buildings. Here's an arch here that somehow survived the melting. Here the concrete melted red brick building has melted downward here, forming a rock curtain. Literally, there is a curtain there, and the water irrigation system is still intact and flowing, and you can still see the building here, and water still flowing out of it, and it's melted downward. Everything, everywhere you look, melted buildings. And again, this is fantastic evidence here. This is not snow. It's concrete. This is all hard as a rock concrete. Okay? Looks like snow. It's concrete. This right here is hard as a rock. It hardened back up like a rock because that's what it was concrete. See the black scorch marks there? Here it looks like this became viscous, and then some type of hot heat field has just made some type of impressions in the concrete here when it was hot. It's just weird, like a field. It looks like a field has made its impressions on this building here. You know, that's what it looks like to me. And again, all melted buildings. You see the brick lines and arches in the background. Here, this building just completely melted down on the inside here. Here you can see the melting away from the building. Here you can see more melting away. Oops, forming new land here. The floor here is completely melted. All these buildings are completely melted. You can still see the brick lines here and the street in between the buildings here. Here you can see how the building has leaked out and this way from itself, forming A-frames and countless A-frames and new land. Here you have orange hot scorch marks. Here you have the building actually just melting down on itself. You can still see the top of the dome here, windows, arches, and columns. Everywhere you look, melted buildings. It's just dripping hot wet. I mean, like it would be wet. Again, look how the building has melted outward from itself, creating new land and over itself. Hot, blackened, scorched, dripping red brick melted. Just incredible. Here you can see like holes from it pulling apart when it became viscous. Here you can see how it was dripping wet like lava. Very similar to lava. Here the brick lines have just souped, formed like a soup, melted down into the ground, melted into itself. More buildings, tops of buildings, flooded, sticking out of the ground, kind of like Planet of the Apes. Here, this building is completely, flooded at the bottom here, where the heat looks like it came up, forming A-frames, melting the building. You got rock curtains here dripping down, brick lines, melted buildings, like Planet of the Apes here. Then you see, you're only missing Statue of Liberty sticking out of the beach here. Here you have brick lines becoming viscous, separating, forming these holes, and then hardening back up again. Here you can see countless brick lines, dripping hot melted building, kind of red and black here when it got hot and dripped. Same here. Here, this is Australia. Here you can really see the pancaked brick lines, formations of the buildings, over and over, brick line after brick line after brick line, tops of the domes, the buildings, all sticking out of the ground, tops of buildings flooded, sticking out of the ground. And again, it's not a valley or a gorge. These are just in between the buildings in here. It's in between buildings here. More melted buildings. And again, look at the right here, how it was hot and viscous and melted and smoothed. Here you can see that it was hot and viscous, and it was flowing wave after wave, and it hardened back up. And again, the irrigation system is still flowing out of the tops of these buildings. Here you can see how it was dripping wet down. This is almost a pocket of survival here, but it's unrecognizable. Tops of buildings sticking out of the ground, melted buildings inside them. Here you can almost make out the red bricks, the whole line of bricks here being cooked into block. That's the brick, all brick there. This is what's left of the red brick after it gets melted by the X factor event. And here we have what are brick lines. And it appears that the red color of the brick has been isolated into bands from the heat. And of course, this is the actual top of the building. And down here is the ground. Here's the top of the building up here. Water is flowing from way over here all the way down. Where's it coming from? It appears that there is more residual technology still intact from the old world. Almost all of these buildings, there is still water flowing out of the tops of them. Somehow, water is being pumped from the water table below all the way up into the tops of these buildings. Everywhere, there's no water anywhere from any snow melt or anything. And it's just coming out like crazy. And then all these buildings, when you're like, there's no water there for it to have built up, and here's more water coming down. We'll get to it. Here we have more water coming out all around. You see melted building with tons and tons of water flowing out of the top of them. Their irrigation systems still intact. Top of this building, water is flowing out, and the sun is hitting it, making it look like liquid hot melted metal or lava. All melted building here, forming rock curtains. Here, more water just coming out of the tops of these buildings and flowing. Irrigation system still intact. Old world Jutarian technology still working till this day. Again, look at the water pumping out of here. Here, water coming out of here. These are red brick lines here. Down there is the bottom of the building. Here, water still flowing out of the top of the building. Melted building, still water flowing out. More melted buildings, water gushing. Beautiful clean water, incredibly clean. And again, everywhere you look here is tops of buildings. These are the tops of buildings here. Okay, brick lines. See the red brick, and then from way over here somewhere, water is still gushing out of the building, the top of it. The irrigation system is still intact. And this goes on and on. If we were to find out how this is happening, I'm sure it would answer a lot of questions for us about the old world. Again, here you can see the rock curtains frozen in midair, and tops of buildings here, arches, brick lines, windows, columns, and then water flowing out still. Here, water coming out all over the place. But you can see the rock curtains that formed when the building melted down on itself. Still red, still arches over here. And water. Here we have water still flowing out of these melted buildings. More water. More melted buildings, more water flowing out the tops. Gushing. Look at this. Gushing down the steps. And again, this was here. This is all inherited. This is red brick. It was already set up by the old world. Set up like this. We inherited this. Nobody set this up. And the water is still flowing. But the red brick is damaged and turned to stone. It's all been damaged and turned to stone. But this was all here before we inherited it from the old world, and the water is still flowing to this day. Just amazing. Again, look at the water coming out of the top of the building here. Again, you see the arches here, and up here more building, and then water flowing out. More melted buildings. See the arch here, the brick lines, and water. Excuse me, more water. Again, what you see here, you got the top of the building, arches, and it got mangled and damaged here, rock curtaining down, and water still flowing out over the building. More water. I mean, we're talking insane amounts of water. It's no joke, the amount of water we're talking here. Again, what's left of this building from the X Factor, it's been mangled. It's been just mangled here and here. This is Pocket of Survival, what's left. Here, water is flowing out still. Brick lines, it's all buildings. And water is still flowing out to this day. And look at this amount of water. Yes, there is residual, quite a buildup of water up in this case. And it's rare, but it's because it's just being built up. It's because gushing so fast out of these buildings. It's being pumped up somehow from the water table into out the tops of these buildings still to this day. Even Niagara Falls and places, and then this, I don't know what that is. Again, there's so much water's coming out, it's building up. It's not rain, no snow. You see this everywhere. You hardly see this though. Usually it's just coming out of nowhere. Like this. This is buildings, arches, different levels of the building. Water is still flowing out. You have this heat expansion columns here, forming what would be crystals if it weren't so dense with concrete. Look at the amount of water flowing out the tops of these buildings. It's enormous. It's no joke. I mean, look at this. Look how small we are here. They are here. Water flowing like crazy. Again. Out in the middle of nowhere. There's no snow anywhere. It's a jungle. Notice the vegetation. It's hot. There's no snow. There's no lake. There's just like water gushing out from the top of these buildings. This is the top of a building. See the brick lines, arch. All tops of buildings here. Down here is where you should be standing. The ocean floor is where you should be standing on ground zero. Again, check it out. You're kind of like out in the middle of a desert here. Residual building, hot melted building, and out of nowhere, water still pumping out the top to the point It's flowing all the way down this way constantly. So you have the pocket of survival. You have water just gushing out of the tops of these buildings, still being pumped from the water table somehow, over and over and over and over and over again and over. Water coming out of nowhere here. Water coming out of nowhere here from the top of the building. Tons of water coming out of here. Gushing. It's no joke, the amount of water coming out of here. It's collecting here, building up and then flowing out. Waterfall here. Look at the way top here, the water coming out of this building, the top of the building here. Again, enormous amount of water flowing out of the top of the building here. Flowing out of the top of the building here. You can see some rock curtains here. Just incredible. The brick lines you can see here cooked into block lines. Water still gushing out of the top of the building here. The brick lines down here. I mean, that's a lot of water right here. You can see how it melted here and rock curtained here, and there's water still coming out of the top of the building here. And here. And here. And here. Of course, it's a little cold here. It's freezing. Here. The waterfall has frozen and formed a water rock. Not a rock curtain, but a frozen water curtain. Frozen water curtain. Very similar to the rock curtain. Water still coming out of the top of the building here. You can see how it melted the building at the bottom here. The X-Factor event did. Water still coming out of here. See the arch. What's left of this building from the old world. Cracked here. And again, more water flowing out of the top here. That was a building. Here's a building. What's left of it, the top, is a pocket of survival, still intact. The heat has come up from the bottom and mangled the building. It sunk down into the ground here when it got grid meltdowns. And then there's still water coming out of the building. The irrigation system has remained intact to this day. Somehow, here's some steps and melted brick, some more brick lines, and water coming out of the top. You could still have a bridge here connecting these buildings. Brick lines melted. You can see how the building melted in wave after wave down this way. Brick lines, brick lines, still water coming out of the top. And here. It's kind of endless. More melted buildings, more water coming out of the top. More melted buildings, more water coming out of the top. Brick lines, top of the building here. Brick lines melted down, and then you have, this is coming all the way, making its way down to here. Over at the top of this other building here. Again, you can see where it was really hot and melted here. It became viscous and wavy and flowing and fluid. It melted the building, and then it's still flowing water out of the top of it. Again, this was here. This fountain setup was here. It's been damaged by the X-Factor event, and the water is still flowing out of the building all the way down, even though the building's completely damaged up to that point and flooded on itself, melting pocket of survival. Just incredible evidence of the old world technology still intact to this day. Water coming out of the top of the building here. And here. And here. And its irrigation system still intact here. Again, you have buildings, building after building, brick line after brick line, tops of buildings, and just water coming out of the tops of these buildings. Time after time, the evidence is overwhelming. Another one, more evidence. Here's some dripping rock curtains of a building here. In conclusion, I would like to thank everybody for your time. I briefly went over our reality and the nature of it, how it resembles a motherboard, Mother Earth. I showed the difference between the old world and the new world. Also showed many different pictures of the architecture style of the old world Tartarians, pockets of survival, many different pictures of pockets of survival, and how the buildings were liquefied, and it showed many different pictures and evidence of red brick melting, heat expansion behavior, more evidence and of melted buildings. I showed many different cases where the buildings, where the irrigation systems are still intact in a lot of these buildings. And in my view, I have overwhelmingly made my case that mountains are melted building from a lost civilization, highly advanced, from an old world, wiped out by some type of grid meltdown cataclysm. I believe I have overwhelmingly made this case and showed many pictures and buildings all over the world with this evidence. So I would like to thank you again for watching the documentary When the Buildings Cried. I love you all.